pleasure to welcome you to the 4th Southwestern Paideia Connections. The idea behind these events is to showcase briefly, in 20 minutes, the research and/or creative works of 2 members of the Southwestern faculty. Faculty are selected based on a variety of criteria and are deliberately chosen from different disciplinary or interdisciplinary areas of the university. They don't plan in advance. They don't know each other's specific topics. Then, in the spirit of the interdisciplinary focus of the Paideia program at Southwestern, the audience is asked to make the connections. This isn't a traditional question and answer period. Rather, it is a time when your brains are working to suggest how these areas might intersect. So you must be active, engaged listeners and contributors to the conversation. Today, we have faculty from art history and economics. Students will be introducing them, Egan and Joe. Following their presentations, President Berger will facilitate the conversation with the audience. I also invite you to join us for a reception in the lobby afterwards. So, Egan? You?
At Southwestern, our core purpose is fostering a liberal arts community whose values and actions encourage contributions towards the well-being of humanity. I'm very thankful today to get to present to you Professor Dirk Early, someone who embodies that ideal not only in his teaching, but also in his research as a professor. The study of economics covers a broad range of topics, but the goal behind learning all of it, I believe, is learning how to improve the well-being of people. Dr. Early's research in housing programs, homelessness, and housing discrimination is not only relevant to the mission of the study of economics, it is reflective of the values of Southwestern. Dr. Early is extremely humble, knowledgeable, and a very effective teacher. In class, he works with us as students rather than talking at us, and he makes highly complex concepts seem basic enough that I could explain them to my grandmother. There is no professor in this school that I would feel more honored to introduce, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Early for his talk, Prices, Housing Assistance, and Poverty.
Well, thank you, Egan, for that, and thanks for the introduction. I'm delighted to spend a little bit of time with you to talk a bit about my research. Again, the title is Prices, Housing Assistance, and Poverty, and we're going to see how those 3 things kind of fit together. I do want to point out this is co-authored work with a colleague of mine from the University of Virginia, Dr. Edgar Olson, and I'm still working with him as someone I met when I was in graduate school and delighted to do this. I'll warn you, this is the only pretty picture I have. After this, it's all numbers, and so it's kind of downhill from here. So first thing I want to do is just to give you a general overview of what we're hoping to accomplish with our work in this project. So there's really 2 main goals. One of the goals is we want to take into account some of the shortcomings of how we currently measure poverty in the United States. So the 2 shortcomings that we're going to engage in, one is the failure to account for the differences in the cost of living across areas when we set poverty thresholds. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but what a poverty threshold is that's the income limit that determines whether a household is poor or not poor. And so right now, that threshold is the same everywhere in the United States. It's the same in Georgetown, Texas, as Manhattan, as San Jose, California. And we know, in fact, prices are very different across those areas. We think we should take that into account, and we come up with a method to do that. The second thing we want to take into account is that we do not include, when we're determining the income of an individual family, some of the resources they receive. Anything they receive that is cash, we do count as part of their income. Anything they receive in what we call as an in-kind transfer from the government, we do not. And by an in-kind transfer, it's just a non-cash transfer. Both Dr. Olson and I are housing economists, so we focus on housing subsidies, and we want to think about whether we can put sort of a dollar value on what that means to that family when we're measuring their income. So just to make sure we understand this, if we take 2 households who are both earning exactly $10,000, one of which receives a housing subsidy, they might have another $7,000 worth of resources. Right now, we exclude that. We do not include that. So for the census, we would consider both of those 2 families to have the same resources. We know, in fact, that's not true. And so we believe that all the in-kind transfers should be somehow incorporated in resources. But again, we focus on housing just because it's an area that we know best. So that's part of what we're hoping to do. The other big thing we're trying to accomplish is let's rethink about how we provide housing assistance in the United States. And so we're going to propose a different model in terms of doing that at the federal level. Before we do that, we need to have at least some sense of how we're doing that currently. And so let me give you sort of a real quick snapshot of that. So all the programs that we're going to be talking about are going to be at the federal level, and the agency that's tasked with administrating those programs is what's called the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. And the way we provide housing takes one of two forms. So one form is what we call tenant-based, and the best example of that is what we call the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So the way this program works is if you receive this assistance, we give you a voucher. You take that voucher out into the private sector, and you find a rental unit that meets the needs of your family. You pay 30% of your income to the landlord, and the federal government makes up the difference. So that's one method in terms of how we provide housing assistance. A different model is what we call project-based assistance. And the best example of that is what we call public housing. Now, instead of going out into the private sector, the way this works is the federal government actually owns the unit, they maintain the unit, they rent out the unit to people who are eligible for the program. So the real difference is one is very fixed in terms of its location, the other gives quite a bit of flexibility to the recipient in terms of living where they want to live. So what we're going to do is think about moving away from this to something different. Another thing we want to keep in mind is how large are these programs currently. And so currently we serve about 5 million households in federal housing programs, and the cost is about $36 billion. So not a huge program at the federal level. We talk now a lot about trillions instead of billions, unfortunately, but still a large chunk of money. Our biggest concern about how we currently provide assistance for housing is the fact that these programs are not what we call entitlement programs. So what we mean by an entitlement program is if you meet the income eligibility and you ask for assistance, you get assistance. That is not true for housing programs, and that's really the exception for all low-income housing programs that we have in this country. So now you can meet the eligibility requirements, you can go in and ask for assistance, and you'll be told, no, I'm sorry, we don't have enough funds to provide you that assistance. And in fact, we're only probably serving 1 out of every 4 eligible households in housing programs currently. What we find even more problematic is since we can't serve everyone, we argue we should serve the poorest of the poor first. And there's nothing about how we decide who gets that assistance currently that forces us to do that. So we want to change those things. And what we are recommending is a move from all the various federal housing programs to one federal housing program. We would move this to what we're calling an entitlement housing voucher program, and we'll talk more about the specifics of that in a little bit. Once we make that change, we're going to estimate what the distribution of benefits would be and also what this might do to poverty rates. Before we can talk much about poverty rates, we need a better sense of how those are currently calculated. So the most recent estimates we have are for 2014, and so the Census Bureau is who's tasked with releasing this information. And so by their estimates, about 15% of the US population would be considered poor in 2014. And again, what that means is that these individuals are living in families where their family income is below that threshold that we talked about. Right? So again, a couple of things that we're trying to fix here is when we talk about family income officially, it does not include some of the resources that the federal government provides those families. And also those poverty thresholds, they do not vary by the cost of living across different areas. Let's drill down into those poverty thresholds a little bit more. So again, from the census website, you can just pick up what those thresholds look like. And they certainly vary in the direction you would expect. Larger families need more resources to no longer be considered poor. But again, the big issue for us is the fact that these thresholds are the same everywhere in the United States. Right? So again, it doesn't matter if you live in Georgetown or San Jose or New York City. These thresholds determine everyone as either poor or not poor. Right? So the first thing we want to do is start to think about if we do adjust these poverty thresholds for the differences in cost of living, what differences would that make in poverty? So the first thing we need to do, though, is get a sense of how big of a difference is there in the cost of living across areas. And surprisingly, we don't have a lot of good information about that, at least at very specific geographic areas. So my co-author and I are actually able to put together a price index for all goods and services. And so we have a sense of how much it costs to purchase sort of a standard bundle of goods and services for every metropolitan area of the country and every non-metropolitan area of a state. Right? And so the way we would sort of interpret these numbers is San Jose we classify as the most expensive place in the country. Again, not shocking for those of you who have ever been there. So the way that we would read this is it's about 40% more expensive than the median area. If we look at the lower cost areas of the country, again, not surprising, they're the rural parts of states. The least expensive we found was non-metropolitan Missouri. And there, the cost of living is about 25% less than the median. But again, if you look at the range of those differences, so notice that the cost of living in San Jose is roughly twice what it is in non-metropolitan Missouri. But again, that poverty threshold is the same in both of those two areas. So we know there's something going on here. We're missing something that's important when we talk about people and whether they're poor or not poor. So what we want to do is we want to take into account that difference across these areas. What we always try to do is compare what we call apple to apple. Again, that's not a very technical phrase, but we want to do that as much as we can. And so when we adjust those thresholds for differences across areas, we then readjust them to make sure we get the same average fraction of the population poor. So we want to keep that 14.8% and then really talk about how those just differences in prices might change the poverty rates as we measure them for different groups or for different areas. So again, the first column is if you just go to the census website, you can find all of these numbers. This is their estimate of what fraction of these populations were poor in 2014. We then so we adjust those thresholds by cost of living, and then we recalculate who would be classified as poor and who's not, and come up with new estimates of those poverty rates. So let's first do it for white and African American households, and there we see very little difference. So even though the poverty rates for both of those groups would drop, they would drop a trivial amount. And that's because there's not much of a difference in terms of where they live in terms of very expensive parts of the country or not very expensive parts of the country. We find something very different for both Asians and Hispanics. And we know both Asians and Hispanics are more likely to live in a part of the country that is expensive. California is a good example. East and West Coast would be other examples. So there we do expect to see a difference. For both of those groups, they're going to be living in areas where we would typically increase those poverty thresholds. So we're going to capture more of those individuals as classified as poor, and that's exactly what we see. So we see fairly substantial increases in the fraction of those populations that we would classify as poor once we change those thresholds. Fairly substantial for Asians of about 16.3%, and still a pretty large increase for Hispanics by almost 9%. We also break this up by the region, the census regions, the 4 census regions, and others in the work that we're doing. So if you again look at the official statistics from census and you ask what's the poorest part of the country, what you would find is the South. So again, in the South, it's about 16.6% of that population is classified as poor. The least poor area would be the Northeast, where a little bit less than 13% of the population is poor. But again, we know there's something else going on here. We know that the cost of living is in fact less in the South on average than it is in the Northeast. And so again, what we want to do is we want to increase those poverty thresholds in the Northeast. Again, we're going to capture more people there who would be considered poor. We're going to lower those thresholds in the South where the cost of living is less. So again, some people who we're currently classifying as poor would no longer classify as poor. So we get sort of the results we would expect. We get higher poverty rates than we currently would observe in the Northeast. And again, that's a fairly substantial increase of about 16%. We get a fairly substantial decrease in the rate of poverty in the South, again, down to 14.7%. And what I find interesting is now that big gap that we saw between those two regions actually completely shrinks. So we see roughly the same rate of poverty in both of those areas once we start to factor into account prices. So again, we first adjust for prices and thresholds, but again, another issue we want to tackle is the fact that when we look at someone's income, we're not taking into account those in-kind transfers that they receive. And again, we focus on housing just because that's an area we know well. So we have some methods to come up with dollar values on the value of those subsidies to these families, and I'm not going to go into any detail on how we do that because it's kind of gory. But our estimates are for tenant-based assistance, it's about a $7,700 subsidy. So again, we completely ignore that currently when we're talking about how much income a low-income household has. For project-based assistance, we don't see quite as much of an increase, but still about $5,600. And just as a reminder, I put the poverty threshold for a 3-person family just to give you a sense of what fraction of that threshold would be met just by this one program. So again, we completely ignore that. We don't take that into account, and we know that can make some differences in terms of our measures of poverty. So again, what we're going to do is start to move those resources into how we measure income of those families to see how many of them would still be classified as poor. And we'll talk about it in a little bit, but a fairly small fraction of the U.S. population has housing programs or housing subsidies. And so if we look at the overall poverty rate, we're not going to see that dramatic of a drop. So we get about a 5% drop in the overall rate of poverty if we start to take into account just housing programs. Not surprisingly, if we look at the people who actually receive that assistance, we see quite a bit of a larger drop in poverty rates. So currently those receiving assistance, they have poverty rates of around 60% in both tenant-based and project-based. Once we start to take into account those resources as part of their income, again, we see fairly large drops, about a 30% reduction in measured poverty for both of those two groups. So the overall poverty rate not changing very much, but again, when we hone into the people who are actually able to receive that assistance, this can be a fairly substantial change. So again, the other sort of big project we undertook here is really thinking about if we rethink about how we provide assistance in terms of housing, what difference might that make? And so again, what we would prefer is to get rid of all the variety of different housing programs we have at the federal level and merge all this into just one program. And again, we're calling that an entitlement housing voucher program. So again, key to us that it's an entitlement. So if you're eligible and you seek assistance, you will gain assistance. And we think that's critical just on fairness grounds. We also would move all assistance to tenant-based assistance. So again, we're going to use vouchers to provide this assistance. And once again, the reasons we want to do that, really two reasons. One, we've been able to show that that type of assistance actually costs less than the project-based. So holding any budget constant, we could actually serve more households if we just made the move to tenant-based and away from project-based assistance. So that's one of the reasons we should do it. We can serve more people. But again, as we argued earlier, I also think this is a better way of providing that assistance. It gives more choice to individuals who receive that assistance than project-based. And so again, they can find the housing unit that best meets their needs. And again, the biggest choice is really in terms of location. Again, we want to compare apples to apples, and so we don't want to design a very expensive housing program and compare that to current housing programs. So we rescale all the factors that we come up with to make sure we're spending the same amount of money as we currently are. So the program that we propose will also cost about $36 billion. To do so, we do need to make some changes. One of the changes we need to make is we do need to reduce that eligibility level. We know now we're only serving about 1 out of 4 households. There's no way we can serve all those households and still only spend $36 billion. So our goal would be to decrease that cutoff until we're able to serve everyone who's below that cutoff. We also slightly reduce the benefits for every family, and the reason we do this is we'd rather spread that assistance amongst more families than centered on just a handful of families. So with those changes, again, we're spending the exact same amount of money. So with this new policy, we want to try to estimate what that might actually mean for families. So the first thing we do is we come up with some estimates of what we call participation rates. So this gives us a sense of how many people are actually able to take advantage of these programs. So the first column is just our current policy. So again, about 3.4% of households are now in some type of federal housing program. And again, that varies also by different ethnic and racial groups. When we move to this entitlement housing voucher program, what we're able to do is actually serve a sizable more families than we currently are. So our estimates are that we would move from about 3.4% of families receiving assistance to about 5%. So again, doesn't look so big in terms of percentages, but again, this is about a 47% increase. We would argue that's fairly substantial, and again, we're not spending any additional money to serve those additional households. We see differences now in terms of participation rate amongst these different groups, and those differences are there as well. But again, for each of these groups, we see fairly substantial increases in participation, which is exactly what we'd want. So it might be as small as maybe 36% for Asians, but for Hispanics, we're showing about a 76% increase in participation. So again, for all the groups that we've been talking about, we see rather dramatic increases in how many of them can actually seek assistance. Since we're measuring poverty, we do the same thing here just to get a sense of how this change in policy might affect poverty rates. And so again, currently with our current policy, we would have a poverty rate about 14.1% if we factored in the value of those subsidies in their income. Since we're serving more households, not surprisingly, when we move to that entitlement housing voucher program, we would lower the rate of poverty. A fairly modest reduction of about 3.4%, so not big changes there. We are happy to see that that reduction would be true for all of the groups that we have considered. A little bit of variation in which groups would see the largest reduction in poverty. But again, all 4 groups would see a reduction. So again, let's just kind of summarize what I'm hoping we took away from the last 15 minutes or so. So one of the things I'm hoping that we took away is that we know now that geographic variations in prices can lead to large differences in poverty rates. So again, we argue when we do not take that into account, we're probably having some errors in terms of who we're considering poor, who we are not considering poor. We know if we add the market value of housing assistance to resources, it has fairly modest effects on the overall poverty rate. But again, when we look at the people who are actually receiving that assistance, it does make quite a difference in terms of rates there. And then finally, what I think is more substantial in terms of what we're doing is reconsidering how we allocate housing policy. And again, if we move to an equally costly, which I want to stress again, no additional cost to taxpayers, to an entitlement housing voucher program, we think we can achieve the following. So one, we think we can increase the number of people served by about 50%. Again, not a bad thing to do. We're going to allow the poorest households access to housing assistance. So again, I would argue that's not something we're doing currently, which is problematic. And again, moving to tenant-based assistance, we would argue would better serve those who actually receive aid. And again, just looking at poverty rates, it does reduce poverty rates, but those reductions are somewhat modest. Thanks.
like many Southwestern students, when I arrived here, I had no idea at all what I wanted to do in any way, major-wise, life-wise, career-wise. I fumbled around. I took some classes. I ended up falling into two wonderful majors, one of which is art history. But it wasn't until my methods class that I took junior year that I really figured out what I want to do. And that's because of Dr. Smith. But it wasn't necessarily because of her teaching, it was because of the way that she taught one reading in one class. And that's the kind of person that Dr. Smith is. That's the kind of teacher that she is. She can reflect on one small aspect of something and really drive home just what makes it interesting and unique. And without me rambling on anymore, I'd like to introduce Dr. Smith.
So thank you very much for that introduction, Joe, and thank you, Laura, and the Brown Chairs for the invitation to speak today. My current research is very different than Dr. Early's. It concentrates on the German expressionist Franz Marc, who was active between about 1906 and 1916 when he died on the front in World War I. And there he is. As co-founder with Vasily Kandinsky of the influential Blaue Reiter group, or Blue Reiter, and you can see them here in the upper left, Marc is a canonical figure in the history of modern European art, on whom much has already been written. And this is just a selection of texts at the bottom. So what am I thinking? Writing about somebody about whom already much has been written. But my research suggests that there are significant aspects of his art that remain insufficiently analyzed or overlooked altogether. One of the premises of art history is that archival and historical research must be combined with the process of looking very closely at our objects of study. This is an essential step in developing an art historical argument. And a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to examine a very small painting by Marc firsthand at the San Diego Museum of Art, where it's part of their permanent collection. And these are very misleading. It looks huge, but it's only 6.5 by 8.5 inches. Made in 1914 with tempera paint on paper, I was struck by how complex the forms appeared for such a small piece, and by how different it seemed than the paintings we usually associate with Marc. And that's a reminder of the blue horses is probably the most famous. I was also struck by how tenuous its connections to conventional representation had become. Knowing the title, Colored Flowers, we may possibly be able to identify the fragile petals of a few blooms near the center of the page, but it would be a stretch to say that flowers are depicted here in any traditional way. Instead, Marc has created a vibrant, energetic composition of abstract forms. Angular, craggy prisms in the upper right erupt from a vortex of green, red, pink, and white shapes. Two solid mounds of blue anchor the lower right corner, and at the left, a geyser of yellow, green, and red is intersected by a thick, emphatic arc of black, a foundation of sorts for the wispy tendrils of muted black which hover at the upper left. Today, by using this image as a starting and an ending point, I will argue that the abstract pictures Marc made during the last years of his career, before he died in 1916, maintain the basic goals that were always fundamental to his project, and that they challenge us to reconsider the significance of both abstraction and primitivism in modern art. The Expressionist movement was characterized by a profound discomfort with industrialized modernity, the effects of which many artists and intellectuals feared was draining authenticity and awareness from contemporary life. In the face of technocratic efficiency and commodified culture, Expressionist artists retreated to the countryside, using their work to plead for the relevance of those so-called primitive values that they saw as predating modern society, spiritual experience, personal emotion, and irrational instinct. Emotional, primitivized, expressive pictures were understood then, not just as personal outcries, but as utopian interventions, spiritual calls to arms, lessons to the viewer on how to be an authentic person. By around 1909, Mark had begun to focus almost exclusively on representing animals, who for him represented a purer form of being and embodied that so-called primitive ethos which marked the expressionist movement as a whole. For Mark, animals signified the values of primal instinct and authenticity that were lacking in an overly materialist and industrialized world. The vast majority of his work from this period depicts animals, all kinds of animals. We have deer, I'm just showing you a selection, cows, dogs, and of course, horses. Lots of horses. Indeed, Mark built his reputation through his luminous representations of animals in natural settings. He had a great affection and affinity for animals and was at heart an animal painter. In his writings, Mark was explicit about the importance of animals to his work. "I see no happier vehicle for the animalization of art," he once wrote, "than the animal painting." And in another text, he explained, "For artists, is there a more mysterious notion than that of how the landscape appears through the eyes of an animal? How does a horse see the world? How does an eagle, a doe, or a dog?" End quote. These statements are cited repeatedly in the literature on Mark, in which his animals are read iconographically, that is, as symbols of a primitivist perspective that strives to stand heroically outside modern society. Symbols of atavistic authenticity, the animals are the badges of Mark's desire to re-sacralize contemporary culture. What happens then when the animals begin to disappear? In 1913, Mark's art undergoes a noticeable shift, and considering the fundamental role of the animal in his work, it comes as a surprise, if not a shock, to see a series of paintings in which abstract designs have almost entirely replaced these animals. In some images, the remnants of animal figures can still be discerned, like in foxes or the mandrill. These are shadowy but perceptible markers of their former selves in an otherwise explosive array of colors. Yet in several pictures, not even these surreptitious nods to the animal remain, and what is left is entirely and unapologetically abstract. What happens to Mark's project of animalizing art when the animal is no longer visible, and the picture is subject to these radical dissections of traditional illusionism? I propose that the fracturing of the picture field could serve the aims of animal painting if the claims of such painting are understood somewhat differently. Returning to the text I cited earlier, in which Mark describes the role of the animal in his art, we might pause for a moment to note the strangeness of Mark's language. What does it mean to animalize art, or for a painting to become animal? What exactly is Mark getting at when he writes that the artist should imagine how the landscape looks through the eyes of an animal, when he wonders how a horse sees the world? Depicting animals as subjects in a painting is very different from attempting to see and paint the world from the perspective of an animal. If we emphasize the perceptual challenge posed by Mark's statement, if we focus, that is, on the problems of vision and knowledge embedded in the question of how an animal sees, it can move us from an iconographic or symbolic reading of Mark's work to a phenomenological or perceptual one. And if Mark's approach to expressionist primitivism increasingly became a problem of representing how the world is perceived by animals, rather than simply showing animals, I think he found a key to discovering how an animal might see the world in the work of a French painter, Robert Delaunay, an artist who actually was not at all interested in notions of the primitive but was very much concerned with issues of visuality and perception. Colored Flowers was originally part of a sketchbook, that's why it's so small, in which a couple of other little abstractions appear several pages earlier, in watercolor and pencil. The repeating circles and semicircles in these sketches remind us that by this time, Mark was well aware of Delaunay, and this is his work on the right, who also experimented with circular forms that spiral and refract across the surface. In fact, in September of 1912, Mark made a special trip to meet the French painter. And in Paris, he saw firsthand Delaunay's most recent series of paintings, which he called simultaneous compositions. Mark, who had a deep interest in scientific treatises on color and vision, also discovered that Delaunay had been working with theories of perception developed by the 19th century German scientist Hermann von Helmholtz. And there he is. Helmholtz focused on the processes of both optical sensation and tactile knowledge, two perceptual mechanisms which he argued operated entirely separately when we are young. As children, Helmholtz writes, we are buffeted by optical sensations that do not cohere into a unified field. They're just an abstract jumble of colors and lights, dazzling and difficult to interpret. These blurs of refracted light and color do not yet come together for young viewers to form anything recognizable. Only by degrees, through successive mental acts of comprehension, do we associate memories of what we have touched, of felt form, with the optical data processed by our senses. It is only through this slow process, wrote Helmholtz, that what we think of as vision comes into being, and we are able to perceive objects and people recognizably. According to this theory, then, we aren't born knowing how to look at the world, we have to grow our way into it. Something that seems as fundamental as seeing is actually not given or automatic, but learned incrementally over time. Scholars have shown how Delaunay's paintings can be understood as demonstrations of Helmholtz's ideas. These artworks build on the separate functions of colored light and tactile materiality and act as a phenomenological exercise in reintegrating them into the remembered looking that for Helmholtz constitutes all looking. For example, in this image, it seems initially to hold unadulterated optical data. Color. Color effects take priority, calling to mind the young child's perception of a world of purely optical forms. But tactility is also structured into the painting through the explicitly present textures of the colored paint, defined not only by how the pigments are applied, but on what surface they reside, the wooden ground of the frame versus the woven canvas. The painting repeats the development of mature vision, beginning with optical and tactile perceptions that are separate and then gradually brought together into contact. As the mind applies past experiences to present perceptions, the knowledge provided by touch is combined with optical data to produce what we commonly experience as seeing. Thus, volumetric shapes only gradually come into view, such as the shadowy forms of the Eiffel Tower in the center of the painting. The transformation that takes place in Mark's painting, before and then after the visit to Paris, is rather startling. I argue that we should understand an image like Cattle as a specific response to Delaunay's art and the Helmholtz model of learned vision. As in Delaunay's work, vivid patches of colored pigment shift and morph, scattered across the surface of the canvas in a prismatic display of chromatic contrasts. The effect is dizzying, a flood of optical information. But the tactile quality of felt things is built into the image as an alternative form of knowledge, moving from thinly applied scraps revealing the primed canvas beneath, to dense solid patches of pigment, to the feathered surfaces made by a lightly loaded brush. portions of the painting also call attention to the flat, touchable surface of the canvas, such as the rectangular matte columns that step across the surface, the dark bisected triangle near the center of the canvas, and the midnight blue patches to its left. Virtually black, these shapes emphasize the flatness of the ground and bring coloristic illusion to a halt, calling to mind the felt surfaces of material objects. The painting repeats the child's experience, then, of divided perception, in which optical information and concrete objects operate independently until the mind begins to associate touched surfaces experienced over time with the colored light and pigment seen in a moment. Only gradually do the optical and tactile elements of Mark's painting cohere into a perceivable subject as the child/viewer's eye travels both perceptually and cognitively around the half circle in the center of the image, which is met by 3 more interlocking half circles that together mark the contours of an animal. But this form is furthermore identifiable only comparatively, with respect to the more conventionally pictured cow on the right. Only with the memory of this first cow are we in a position to recognize the fractured surfaces of the central animal, which otherwise would be almost entirely unintelligible. As with Delaunay, Mark's painting thus slows the viewer's process of looking, repeating the conditions in which one learns how to see. So, Delaunay's influence on Mark seems to have been significant, but there were important differences as well. Delaunay's simultaneous compositions look out on urban Paris, after all, summoning the Eiffel Tower, that quintessential sign of metropolitan modernity, while Mark's contrasting hues and tactile surfaces spiral around horses, monkeys, dogs, and cows. The stylistic transformation that took place in Mark's post-1912 works did not divert him from his overarching project of animalizing painting. In fact, Mark's animal painting overlapped nicely with the childhood model of learned looking. We could think of Mark's animals as a variant of the broader expressionist fascination with children. Animals offered the same promise of a pure, uncorrupted, and anti-civilized subject. The 2 models for a primitive rejection of the modern world, animals and children, are in some ways 2 sides of the same coin. Yet the animal represented an even purer or more archaic form of the primitive, since animals make visible in the present the Darwinian prehistory of humans. Darwin's theories were widely read by Mark as well and discussed in this time, and in his evolutionary paradigm, animals are, of course, the children of human history. If Helmholtz postulated that a very young child sees the world as a blizzard of abstract forms, colors, and light, then animals, embodiments of that which is most elemental and primitive in all humans, must perceive the world in this way as well. And when those forms begin to cohere into something perceptible, something that conforms to objects touched and known in the world, this visually marks the evolutionary journey from animal to human, from the natural to the cultural. To see the world from the eyes of an animal, then, to, as Mark put it, animalize painting, is to repeat the phenomenological experience of slow, learned looking, now conceived as a process that reaches into the prehistory of the world and not merely the lifespan of an individual. Which brings us finally back to the question of Mark's abstractions. Like the little sketchbook picture, in which there are no longer any recognizable animals to mark this as an animal painting. Colored Flowers is a small, softer spoken version of Mark's large-scale simultaneous compositions, but it explores the same sorts of phenomenological experiences. This little abstraction participates in Mark's ambitious quest to animalize painting, to conjure, that is, the perceptual act of primitive, divided vision. And by doing so, it gives us a somewhat altered framework for theorizing both early 20th century abstraction and modernist primitivism. Forms playfully refract across its surface, a kaleidoscopic interplay of pinks, yellows, greens, and blues. Optically perceptible arrays of colors interweave and pirouette around the surface. Colors crawl up the left, erupt at the top, and waterfall into a pool of pink in the center. As in the cattle painting, brief but noticeable moments of tactility operate alongside or at odds with this retinal dance. The matte tan surface that peaks between the green and yellow curves towards the left, interrupting the passage from one color to the next, reminding the viewer of the paper's material presence. The thickly black arch in this same area, which puts the brakes on dazzling optics in favor of blunt tactility, or the dense physical patch of pink pigment that hovers just to the right of the black arch, both quoting and coloristically reversing its insistent tactility. Gradually, hesitantly, the known forms of a flower emerge from this play of optic and haptic. Recognizing these petals is presented as a gradual, hard-won cognitive experience. Like children or animals, we delight in the refracted, saturated colors, pause at the tactile reminders of the felt world, and slowly learn to see. Colored Flowers and its companions should be seen within the context of Mark's overall goal of showing how an animal sees the world, a project in which simultaneous abstracted compositions opened the window on sight. They do not refer to, allegorize, or symbolize primitive seeing. These fractured abstractions hope to embody primitive perception, enabling every viewer to experience again that primitive form of seeing and thus being, freezing vision at that evolutionary moment when we too were really just animals. Mark's animalized abstraction produced a cerebral kind of primitivism in which the complexities of optical perception became married to the atavistic promise of a long-remembered past. Thanks.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed and were challenged and uplifted by these two beautiful presentations. The wonderful thing about this program is that it not only allows us to celebrate two outstanding scholars within our community, but it also challenges us to look for those otherwise invisible connections. And so I hope you were taking lots of notes. I have 2 pages of notes here. And so I'm not without notes, but I want to open this up to you and to allow our speakers to enjoy your reactions. They will be available during the reception for questions, but this is a chance for you to share connections that you saw between what might have at first appeared to be 2 disparate presentations. Disparate, not desperate. Sorry. They weren't desperate, but they were seemingly disparate. Maybe they were seemingly desperate, but they certainly are not. Yeah, we'll start with Elaine, please.
That was great. I really enjoyed both talks. Oh, sorry, I have a microphone. Do you want me to hold it?
Just
You have
hold it.
Okay, he's going to hold it.
Okay.
What I was thinking about during both your presentations was the work of abstraction and how it operates. I mean, it's obvious in Kim's talk, perhaps, but the idea that abstraction slows you down. And I love this idea of slow vision that gets provided for you by the kind of abstraction that you're talking about. And it made me think about Dirk's presentation and how abstraction works there too, right? So the poor are an abstraction. We don't even think about them as particularized in any way. But I kept thinking that for you, mathematics provides the slow vision, right? It forces us to slow down and break through that abstraction and actually see what's really there. So that's what I was thinking about. I don't know if they want to comment, but.
No, they won't.
That.
Thank you, Elaine. Yeah, please. Laura.
Thanks. Yeah, the other thing that I thought was very interesting in the two is that Mark is responding to commodified culture, as are a lot of the issues that Dirk is talking about as well, right? Is that we've got this commodified cultures, and that these are both kinds of reactions to commodified culture to try to make it not so commodified anymore. So that was the connection I saw between both of them.
Thank you, Laura. Who else? Yes, please.
Hi. So I thought that the perceptions of Franz Marc's work and how we perceive certain civilizations could really be used to apply economic policy and public policy reform. If we were to think in the lives of others, then that could fund the $36.6 billion better to people. So that's just what I...
Thank you. Yes, over here, and then we'll go to Stephen Tibbs.
Hello. Well, expressionism is a result of the romanticism of the Renaissance and the super positivity and idealism of the idealistic movement. And so it was during World War I, and all these ugliness of the world came out, and it was just this rawness. So that was in expressionism, of course. And so I connect this to the housing policy reforms, such as the tenant-based focus, and just how this, although it is the more logical and more sustainable way to distribute funds, it's also a more flexible way to live. It allows for more individuality and this freedom of self to, enhance the, social everything, social spirit.
Thank you. Stephen Tibbs.
Things are not as simple as they appear. Mark's colored flowers initially appears to be total abstraction, but only if you have applied learned vision and have delved into his background do you understand that really this is all based upon his view of animals and the way he painted animals. And similarly, if you simply look at the current way in which we allocate housing among the poor, it looks perfectly fair because everybody gets the same amount, but it's only when you look behind that and realize that, well, maybe people shouldn't get the same amount because they live in different parts of the country where the costs of living are different, or because some get subsidies and some don't. Do you understand that what you're seeing is really more complicated than you think it is?
Thank you, Stephen. Trouble.
So basically what I'm thinking about here is the social application of these two things, right? On the one hand, Dr. Smith's presentation has told us that Marx's abstractions are actually things which force us to occupy a particular moment in what they considered evolutionary space in order to realize that space as it should be, right? Similarly, the data that we heard in Dr. Early's presentation is something which invites us to slow down our vision and go back into this and actually recognize the truths beyond or deep that underlay those abstractions that we're talking about. In both cases, what we're talking about is something in which the visual arts and economics use different tools or means in order to bring out an underlying truth that is otherwise obscure, right?
Thank you. Yes, please, Ken.
I couldn't help thinking of another angle. And you, Dr. Early, came up very early stating about how little we're spending on this compared to the overall economics. And then the second presentation was about a beautiful painter who died in a war and how much we spent on that war.
Thank you. Yeah, is it Laura? Right there.
Sorry. Oh, goodness. Okay, so watching the wrong person. It's really kind of building on what several people have already said, but thinking about the starting point for who's doing the seeing. And I was just struck when you made the shift from the animal as the object to the animal as the seer, and not to equate low-income people with animals by any stretch. I'm just saying, but where do you start instead of sort of this applied standard that really doesn't actually look at a person's actual situation, and just where's your starting point from what you're seeing, from what you're looking at, who's doing the looking and who's doing the perceiving of the reality. So it's just interesting.
Yeah, Jim, and then Eric.
I thought that the content of both presentations was about responses to modernity and kind of that ongoing process that we as a human family have been dealing with for a couple of 100 years now or more, and which is continuing for us into the future. And maybe it's something about our earlier experiences of life that makes it a difficult transition for us. So to try to see reality through the eyes of an animal or a child, I think is a reaction to that, and also to try to figure out what to do about those people that get left out in our modern society is also a reaction to modernity.
Thank you. Eric, and then Chris.
So thank you for the presentations, and I also thank those of you who've spoken so far for your very illuminating questions, which are giving me as much to think about as the presentations have. But I was just struck by a really sort of simple thing fairly early on, which is I think our comfort, and we were talking about this in one of my classes the other day, our comfort with positioning ourselves as interpreters of art is much greater than our comfort with positioning ourselves as interpreters of numbers. Mm-hmm. And we want to talk about running the numbers, and we ascribe a truth to numbers and a sort of reality to numbers, and I use that word in quotation marks, that I think, I don't know, this just has me thinking about, again, the extent to which we're a lot more comfortable interpreting paintings quite often than we are numbers.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Chris.
The thing that struck me is both presentations kind of force you not to accept the status quo. Dr. Smith, I took your line. There have been numerous books written about Mark's paintings. What else is there to write? We've been providing housing assistance to people for years, ever since the New Deal beyond. We can't do anything different. We can tweak it. We can't do anything different. Yet by, again, slowing down, taking the time to relook at something, relook at an issue, relook at a problem, you can really come up with some new ideas and some new solutions for issues. I think that's important. It has potential well outside these two areas.
Thank you. Way in the back. I don't know who's closer. You're right in the middle. They're going to fight it out.
I don't want to.
So what kept coming to my mind during the presentations was that both were focused on humanity, and that we're in a very productivity-centered society, in a very quantified society. We're always focusing on efficiency and productivity, but how do you measure quality of life? And I think these are two different ways of measuring that, whether you're doing it through economics or through art history and getting away from industry, whether it's becoming more privative or doing it through government. And I think Ethan began with saying Southwestern's our mission statement and our purpose, and I think both really spoke to that in completely different ways, and I just really appreciated how they both really were trying to empathize and sympathize with whether it's the view or how we view things, ultimately for our quality of life and getting back to our humanity and caring about other, our well-being and the well-being of others.
Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah.
Hi. So I work at Carver Elementary, and inside of the building there's a visual of Mark's blue horses, which I had no idea where he was the artist until today. But I was thinking about the quality, as she was previously saying, the quality of life, and both art and aid for living are both arguably enhance our qualities of life. So I was wondering how one could perceive one more accessible than the other.
Thank you. Who else would like to share? Yeah, Gabe.
I was struck by the idea, or at least the notion of place and environment, and how in almost both instances, it was a very human element to come up with a language or a vocabulary to talk about that. And so it seemed very human to me to see like this, how both in urban planning or in just looking at that grounding element of that black stroke, how those are very intentional things and almost very delicate, intimate human things. It was just, I thought it was very striking.
Thank you. Yes, please, Brian.
I was also struck by place, but more in the definition of geography, with Delaney focusing on more of the city area, and Mark focusing more on the country, and just what that kind of impact has on space and how we define poverty in the South versus other parts of the country.
Thank you. Who else wants to share?
What's the short summary of your 2 pages of votes there?
Well, I've been checking them off as people have been saying them, and I think that you all got all of mine, and you said it far more eloquently than I did. The notion of abstract forms and this idea of distilling down, and the idea of taking things that are invisible and making them visible, which were in both of these talks, and that was already said, so I can't tell you that one. Then there was the discomfort with modernity, which several people mentioned. Laura was the first, and this idea of countryside versus city, and the idea of highlighting the differences between those, whether it's aesthetically or actually economically, that there are these differences that people really, in one case, they were ignoring, in another case, they were trying to go out of their way to make that difference even clear. So that idea of difference, but again, that was said. And again, the point that someone made about what happens when the animals appear, and this basic question that both scholars really were challenged by, which is what is missing in these things, and how do you explain what is missing, and how do you try to overcome that? I thought that was a profound similarity between the two. And then, as someone else said, looking that these images were now looking through the eyes of the animal, and Laura was talking about this, about the perception through different vantage points, which I think is a common theme of both of these, depending upon kind of, who is the person looking. And then I love this phrase at the very end about learned looking, which I'm going to steal, by the way. I'll tell you that right now, Kim. And this idea of course, learning how to see, which is a great thing. But this idea of learned looking is I think, spectacular. Then this simultaneous compositions that we saw, where lots were happening at once. It really is this idea of abstracting a lot of data at once, which really, I think, is another common thread from both of these things. I mean, that's what you were both doing, and people hadn't really done before in a way, or at least not in those various forms. Seeing the abstract and making meaning, which, of course, is something that I'm very sensitive to, the idea of making meaning, which, of course, could be for everything. And the last thing that I had, which, again, was alluded to, is this interesting synergy between society, community, and the individual. That these are always connected. And in one presentation, it is what is the society doing to uplift the individual. And then in the other one, it's an individual. It's the artist who is trying to uplift society through their works. And so there's this really interesting synergy between the self and the everybody. And it goes both ways, which is something that I was seeing. And then, of course, the idea of uplifting life, which both of these scholars are trying to understand, how artists do that through the beauty of the works, and how economists can do that by making life just better for people from a financial point of view. So those are the ones that I got, Jim, but I think you all said them, so I will not repeat them. Unless there is one last comment that someone would like to share. Okay, right here.
So I'm gonna have trouble, like, I guess, articulating it. But the whole idea of you guys both provide different ways of creating schemas to see the world. I feel like the whole idea of each subject provide a specific way, a specific schema to see the world, and these schemas, in a way, there's a feedback loop between the schemas we create, the environment that we were able to shape, and the way that the environment shapes our schemas, and there's just an ever-evolving schemas that we're able to create over time, allowing us to perceive details that are not as apparent, and the more details we're able to see through these schemas is to the extent that we can do something about it and actually improve things or grow empathy or acknowledgement of poverty and appreciation of art. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. This is one of my favorite events at Southwestern, and it's a new tradition that really was started by some of the Brown professors, and those Brown chairholders who came to me with this idea are here, and so I want to just acknowledge them. First of all, the person who hosted this event, so Dr. Hobgood, if you could stand up, and then Dr. Selbin in the back, and Dr. Cooper in the middle, and Dr. Pierce up there. Will you please stand and recognize these individuals for their creative idea of coming up with the series?